On this vote, the yeas are 222 and the nays are 200. The motion is adopted.
Protect America's Workforce Act would overturn President Trump's executive order from March that ended collective bargaining rights for roughly 1 million Americans who work for the federal government. Since the order was made, the administration has ripped up more than 700,000 union contracts, and it left our federal workforce more vulnerable to unfair treatment and political interference. I'm proud that since introducing this bill, it's won the support of 226 of my colleagues in this chamber. This majority includes Democrats and Republicans who recognize that collective bargaining is not a partisan issue. It's about fairness, dignity on the job, and a voice in the workplace.
In a dramatic rebuke to President Trump, more than a dozen Republicans joined Democrats on Wednesday to advance a bill overturning one of his major executive orders. The U.S. House voted 222 to 200 to nullify Trump's March order, which had stripped collective bargaining rights from nearly 1 million federal workers.
Good to see you. Welcome to Dr. John Podcast. 13 House Republicans broke with Trump to vote with Democrats, 222 to 200, to advance legislation overturning his executive order, stripping collective bargaining rights from nearly 1 million federal workers. The vote marked the first significant congressional challenge to Trump's executive order blitz, showing that some GOP lawmakers value district priorities over absolute presidential loyalty. Let me walk you through exactly what happened, because the details matter enormously for understanding the current state of play. The 13 members who defected were not marginal figures or perpetual dissenters. They were mainstream Republicans who have generally supported Trump's agenda, but who concluded that the political costs of backing his attack on federal worker union rights outweighed the benefits of maintaining absolute loyalty.
The measure was pushed forward by Democratic Representative Jared Golden, who used a discharge petition, a rare congressional tool that forces a vote when a majority of lawmakers support it, even against leadership wishes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Protect America's Workforce Act would overturn President Trump's executive order from March that ended collective bargaining rights for roughly 1 million Americans who work for the federal government. Since the order was made, the administration has ripped up more than 700,000 union contracts. The order was the largest act of union busting in American history, and it left our federal workforce more vulnerable to unfair treatment and political interference. I'm proud that since introducing this bill, it's won the support of 226 of my colleagues in this chamber. This majority includes Democrats and Republicans who recognize that collective bargaining is not a partisan issue. It's about fairness, dignity on the job, and a voice in the workplace. In his order, President Trump said ending collective bargaining was about protecting our national defense. But in my district and many others,
the districts these members represent tell an important part of the story. Many of them have significant federal employment. Military bases and VA hospitals and homeland security facilities where the executive order stripping collective bargaining rights was deeply unpopular, and where voting to protect those rights was essential for political survival. This is the kind of district-level political pressure that can break party unity on specific issues even when broader loyalty remains intact. It demonstrates that Trump's control over the Republican Party is not absolute, but rather depends on whether his positions align with the political interests of individual members. When those interests diverge, when supporting Trump means losing your seat,
affected workers build our warships and care for our veterans. These workers make our country safer and stronger every single day. America didn't vote to silence these workers, but this bill gives all of us a chance to restore their voices. Every one of us in this body was sent here by our constituents to represent their voice in Congress. While the majority leadership has broad prerogative to set the calendar and control the flow of legislation, no one here believes they should have absolute power to determine which bills see the light of day and which don't. The discharge petition process exists to give members of Congress some agency. It's a release valve to ensure that good bills with broad support cannot be held up forever by a leadership team. It gives us a fair shot at building a coalition to do the people's work and get an up or down vote on the floor. That's exactly how my colleagues and I have spent the past several months. We've built a bipartisan coalition representing a majority of the House in support of this bill and done the work to bring it to the floor.
At least some members are willing to defect regardless of the threats and attacks that follow. Trump's response to the defection was characteristically volcanic. He took to Truth Social to blast the defectors as RINOs, betraying America and claiming that unions love China and that these weak Republicans will pay at the ballot box. The attacks were personal and threatening, exactly the kind of intimidation that has kept most Republicans in line throughout Trump's political career. But the 13 members who defected apparently concluded that the threats were worth absorbing in order to protect their political standing in districts with significant federal employment.
I know that none of us ran for office with a vision of governing by discharge petition. Most of us long for the return of regular order, where bills are assessed in committee, seriously debated, and given a vote. But here we are. As it stands, we must use every tool available to do the people's work. I'm grateful to my 8 Republican colleagues who co-sponsored the bill, led by my friend Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and to the 5 Republicans who signed the discharge petition to ensure that this chamber would hold this vote. If the majority we built over the past few months sticks together, we can overturn this union-busting executive order, and we can show America that this body will protect workers' rights. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule. Let these workers have their day on the House floor. Give them an up or down vote. They deserve that much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Trump's executive order had stripped collective bargaining rights across key agencies, including defense, state, veterans affairs, justice, energy, and parts of homeland security, treasury, and agriculture.
This is a calculation that more Republicans may start making as we get closer to the midterms. The question of whether Trump's wrath is more dangerous than voter backlash in competitive districts. The union vote showed that at least some members have decided that local political survival outweighs loyalty to the president on specific issues where his policies are unpopular. But here is where the story gets more complicated and more interesting than the simple humiliation narrative would suggest. Because on the exact same day that Trump lost the union vote, he won on another front by signing the executive order blocking states from enforcing their own AI regulations. Speaker Mike Johnson rallied support for this action, despite Democratic mockery and criticism, demonstrating that Republican unity remains intact on issues where there is not the same kind of local political pressure that drove the union defections. The AI order represents a significant assertion of federal preemption over state regulatory authority, essentially telling California and other states that their efforts to regulate artificial intelligence will be overridden by the federal government. And it had the full backing of the Republican establishment, even as the union fight was playing out simultaneously. The contrast between the two outcomes shows that Trump's relationship with Congress is not simply strong or weak. It is strong on some issues and weak on others, and understanding the difference is crucial for predicting where future conflicts might emerge. The congressional ball that Trump attended on December 12th provided another window into how he is managing the tensions with lawmakers who have been willing to defy him on specific issues. Rather than boycotting the event or refusing to engage with the defectors, Trump showed up and worked the room, reportedly strong-arming holdouts and making clear that Republicans will deliver while Democrats destroy. This is vintage Trump, combining threats with charm, making sure that anyone who crossed him knows there will be consequences, while also maintaining relationships that keep the coalition functional. The ball gave Trump an opportunity to remind members that he is still the dominant figure in the party and that their political futures depend on his support, even as the union vote had demonstrated that his dominance has limits when local political pressures point in a different direction. The timing of all this could not be more significant given the shutdown that is looming if no budget deal is reached by the December 20th deadline. The government has been lurching from funding crisis to funding crisis, and the deadline pressure creates leverage for both Trump and congressional leaders to force decisions that might not happen under normal circumstances. Trump wants to use the shutdown threat to extract concessions on his priorities, while members who just defected on the union vote are worried about being blamed for dysfunction that hurts their re-election prospects. The combination of the union defection and the approaching shutdown and the ongoing internal tensions over policy and strategy creates an environment where anything could happen and where Trump's ability to hold his coalition together is being tested in real time. The union vote deserves careful analysis because it represents the first time since Trump returned to office that a significant number of Republicans were willing to break with him on a floor vote that directly challenged one of his executive orders. The 13 members who defected were not marginal figures or perpetual dissenters. They were mainstream Republicans who have generally supported Trump's agenda, but who concluded that the political costs of backing his attack on federal worker union rights outweighed the benefits of maintaining absolute loyalty. The districts these members represent tell an important part of the story. Many of them have significant federal employment, military bases and VA hospitals, and homeland security facilities where the executive order stripping collective bargaining rights was deeply unpopular and where voting to protect those rights was essential for political survival. This is the kind of district-level political pressure that can break party unity on specific issues even when broader loyalty remains intact. And it demonstrates that Trump's control over the Republican Party is not absolute, but rather depends on whether his positions align with the political interests of individual members. When those interests diverge, when supporting Trump means losing your seat, at least some members are willing to defect, regardless of the threats and attacks that follow. Trump's Truth Social response to the defection was revealing in several ways, both for what he said and for how the defectors and their constituents are likely to receive it. Calling the 13 members RINOs and claiming they are betraying America and that unions love China follows the standard playbook of questioning the loyalty and patriotism of anyone who crosses him. But the attacks may actually reinforce the calculation that the defectors made. If Trump is going to attack them anyway, if loyalty does not actually protect them from his wrath, then they might as well do what they need to do for their districts and accept the political consequences. The threat of being called a RINO only works as a deterrent if members believe it will cost them more than the alternative. And for members in districts with significant federal employment, being seen as protecting worker rights may be more valuable than being seen as loyal to Trump on this particular issue. The AI executive order that Trump signed on the same day represents a very different political dynamic, one where Republican unity remained intact because there was no comparable local political pressure pushing members to defect. The order blocks states from enforcing their own AI regulations, essentially preempting California and other states that have been trying to establish guardrails on how artificial intelligence is developed and deployed. Tech companies have been lobbying aggressively for this kind of federal preemption, arguing that a patchwork of different state rules would make it impossible to operate efficiently. And Republicans have generally been sympathetic to these arguments given their alignment with deregulatory principles and their relationships with the tech industry. The result was that Trump got full Republican support for the AI order even as he was losing on the union vote, demonstrating that the defections are targeted rather than general, and that party unity remains strong on issues where there is not local pressure pointing in a different direction. Speaker Johnson's role in managing these dynamics deserves attention because he is caught between competing pressures that are extremely difficult to navigate. On one hand, he needs to maintain a functional relationship with Trump and ensure that the president's priorities can advance through the House. On the other hand, he needs to protect members in competitive districts who face political pressures that may conflict with Trump's agenda. The union vote showed the limits of his ability to enforce discipline. 13 members defected despite whatever pressure leadership applied. But his success in rallying support for the AI order shows that he can still deliver for Trump when the political dynamics are favorable. The challenge for Johnson going forward is to identify which issues are likely to produce defections and which are likely to produce unity, and to manage Trump's expectations accordingly so that the president is not constantly surprised and enraged when members break ranks on politically toxic votes. The contrast between the union vote and the AI order also reveals something important about how different issues play in different political environments. Federal worker union rights are a tangible issue that affects real people in specific districts. Members can visit VA hospitals and military bases and see the workers whose collective bargaining rights were stripped by Trump's executive order. And those workers have families and friends and communities that vote. AI regulation is a more abstract issue that does not have the same local political salience. Voters are not organizing around whether California should be able to regulate artificial intelligence. And that abstraction gives members more freedom to vote on ideological lines lines without worrying about immediate political consequences. The lesson is that Trump's most vulnerable policies are those that affect visible constituencies in specific places, and that his safest policies are those that involve abstract principles or diffuse impacts that do not generate local political pressure. The congressional ball dynamics that played out on December 12th show how Trump handles situations where he has suffered a setback, doubling down on relationship management while making clear that there will be consequences for disloyalty. Trump is skilled at working a room, at making people feel simultaneously valued and threatened, and the ball gave him an opportunity to exercise that skill on members who had just witnessed what happens when you cross him. The strong arming of holdouts reportedly involved both carrots and sticks, promises of support and assistance paired with warnings about what happens to Republicans who vote wrong. This combination of inducement and intimidation has been effective throughout Trump's political career, but the union vote showed that it does not always work. And the question is whether the ball appearance will deter future defections, or whether members have now seen that defection is survivable. The shutdown threat that is hanging over all of these dynamics creates additional pressure that affects how everyone calculates their interests. Government shutdowns are always unpopular. Voters blame whoever they think is responsible, and the party that controls all branches of government has a hard time avoiding that blame. Republican members who just defected on the union vote are particularly sensitive to being seen as causing dysfunction. They are already taking heat from Trump for their vote, and they do not want to be blamed for a shutdown. On top of that, this creates cross pressures that are very difficult to manage. Loyalty to Trump on budget matters may conflict with political survival in districts where the shutdown is hurting constituents, and members have to decide which pressure is more important. The union defectors have already shown they are willing to prioritize local political survival, and the shutdown fight may produce additional defections if Trump pushes for positions that members in competitive districts cannot defend. The 1 million federal workers affected by Trump's union-stripping executive order represent a significant constituency that is now politically mobilized in ways that will affect the midterms. These are not anonymous bureaucrats in Washington. They are Border Patrol agents and VA nurses and Homeland Security personnel who live and vote in communities across the country. Many of them voted for Trump. Federal workers are not monolithically Democratic, but the attack on their collective bargaining rights has created resentment that could affect turnout and vote choice in ways that matter in close races. The 13 Republicans who defected were responding to this reality, recognizing that their constituents include federal workers whose support they need, and other Republicans in similar districts may face the same pressure as the election approaches. The polling data on federal worker rights shows that the public is not with Trump on this issue. Surveys consistently show that a majority of Americans support collective bargaining rights for workers, including federal employees, and that attacking unions is not a winning political message outside of the Republican base. This creates a vulnerability that Democrats will certainly exploit in the midterms, running ads highlighting Republican votes against worker rights and connecting them to broader themes about which party stands with working families. The union vote gave Democrats a weapon they can use in competitive districts, pointing to the 13 Republicans who defected as evidence that even some Republicans recognize how toxic Trump's anti-worker agenda has become, and using the vote to draw contrast with Republicans who stayed loyal to Trump despite the unpopularity of his position. The most important takeaway from the December 11th showdown is that Trump's control over the Republican Party is real, but conditional. He can command loyalty on most issues most of the time, but when local political pressures point in a different direction, at least some members are willing to defect regardless of his threats and attacks. The union vote demonstrated this dynamic clearly. 13 members concluded that protecting federal worker rights in their districts was more important than maintaining perfect loyalty, and they absorbed Trump's attacks because the alternative was worse. This is not a general revolt. Most Republicans stayed loyal, but it establishes a precedent that defection is possible and survivable when the political circumstances demand it. The question of whether more defections will follow depends on several factors that are still playing out, including how the union defectors fare politically and whether Trump follows through on his threats to support primary challengers against them. If the 13 members win their primaries and their general elections, if defection proves to be politically cost-free or even beneficial, then other members will be encouraged to break with Trump when their local interests demand it. But if the defectors face serious primary challenges, and some of them lose, then the lesson will be that defection carries unacceptable costs and that members should stay loyal regardless of local pressures. The outcome of the 2026 primaries will be closely watched as a test case for how much independence Republicans can exercise within the Trump coalition. The shutdown dynamics that are unfolding alongside the union fight create additional opportunities for defection because budget negotiations involve trade-offs that some members may not be able to accept. Trump has been using the shutdown threat to extract concessions on his priorities, demanding funding for border security and cuts to programs he opposes. But some members represent districts where those cuts would be politically devastating. The pressure to reach a deal before the December 20th deadline is intense, and the negotiations may produce outcomes that force members to choose between loyalty to Trump and loyalty to their constituents in ways that parallel the union vote. The pattern of targeted defection on politically toxic issues may become more common as members learn that they can survive Trump's attacks if the underlying vote is defensible to their voters. The AI order success shows that Republican unity remains strong on issues where there is ideological consensus and no local political pressure pushing in a different direction. Tech deregulation is popular with the Republican donor base and consistent with the party's general preference for limiting government interference in markets. And there was no constituency of AI regulation supporters mobilizing in Republican districts to pressure members to vote against the order. This contrast with the union vote illustrates the limits of the defection pattern. Members are not going to break with Trump on everything. They are going to break with him specifically on issues where local political survival requires it. The AI order did not create those local pressures, and so the party remained unified even as it was splitting on the union question. The political implications for the midterms depend on whether Democrats can effectively use the union vote and similar issues to draw contrasts with Republicans in competitive districts. The 13 defectors provide a talking point. Even Republicans recognize how extreme Trump's anti-worker agenda is. But Democrats need to connect that talking point to broader themes about economic fairness and working-class interests that resonate with swing voters. The risk is that the union vote gets lost in the noise of everything else happening, the shutdown and the foreign policy fights and the legal battles and all the rest, and that voters do not register the significance of Republicans voting against worker rights. Democrats need to amplify the issue and connect it to people's lives if they want it to matter electorally. The congressional ball dynamics show that Trump is not going to accept the union vote defection without pushback. He is going to use every opportunity to pressure members to stay loyal and to make clear that there are consequences for breaking ranks. The strong-arming that reportedly occurred at the ball is just one example of how Trump maintains discipline, combining social pressure with political threats in ways that keep most members in line. But the effectiveness of this approach depends on members believing that the threats are credible and that the consequences of defection are worse than the consequences of loyalty. The union vote challenged that belief, showing that members can survive Trump's attacks if their underlying position is defensible, and subsequent defections will test whether the lesson has been learned. The broader pattern of GOP tensions over policy and strategy that we have been documenting throughout this series helps situate the union vote within a larger story of a coalition under stress. The foreign policy splits over Russia and Ukraine, the shutdown frustrations that have members blaming each other, the green feud that exposed divisions over priorities, the Alabama election results that showed base frustration. Each of these developments represents a crack in what was supposed to be unified Republican governance. And the union vote adds another crack to the collection. None of these fractures by themselves threaten Trump's control of the party, but together they create a picture of a coalition that is not as solid as it appeared when Trump first returned to office. The question for Trump going forward is whether he can manage these tensions without making them worse, whether the threats and attacks and pressure tactics that have worked in the past will continue to work as political circumstances change and as members face different calculations about their interests. The union vote suggests that at least some members have concluded that local political survival matters more than loyalty, and that realization could spread as the midterms approach and as members in competitive districts start making decisions about how to position themselves for their races. Trump needs to find ways to keep these members loyal without pushing them into positions that cost them their seats, and that requires a level of strategic flexibility that has not always been his strong suit. The institutional dynamics between the executive and legislative branches that the union vote exposed are going to continue to matter regardless of how the immediate political fights are resolved. Congress has its own constitutional role and its own political interests that do not always align with what the president wants. And members who feel like they are being treated as rubber stamps rather than as partners in governance are going to push back in various ways. The union vote was one form of pushback, legislative action that directly challenged an executive order. But there are other forms available, including oversight investigations and appropriations riders and procedural delays that can frustrate administration priorities without direct confrontation. The relationship between Trump and Congress is going to remain complicated as long as members have their own political interests to protect. The media narrative around the union vote has emphasized the humiliation angle. Trump threatened and Congress laughed him off. But that framing overstates what actually happened. 13 Republicans defected on one specific issue where local political pressures made defection necessary, but the vast majority stayed loyal, and Trump won on the AI order the same day. This is not a story of comprehensive defiance, but rather of targeted resistance on politically toxic issues. And understanding the difference is important for predicting what might happen next. Trump's control over the party is weakened at the margins but remains strong at the core, and the union vote shows both the limits and the persistence of that control simultaneously. The bottom line from the December 11th showdown is that Trump's relationship with congressional Republicans is complicated and conditional rather than simple and absolute. He commands loyalty on most issues most of the time, but when local political pressures conflict with his agenda, at least some members are willing to defect and absorb his attacks. The union vote showed this dynamic clearly. 13 Republicans broke ranks to protect federal worker rights in their districts, while the AI order showed that unity remains intact on issues without comparable local pressure. Trump responded with characteristic attacks on the defectors and worked the congressional ball to pressure holdouts. But whether these tactics will deter future defections remains to be seen. The shutdown deadline and the approaching midterms create additional pressure that will continue to test the coalition's cohesion. Members facing tough races have to calculate whether loyalty to Trump or responsiveness to local concerns is more likely to help them win, and those calculations may produce additional defections on additional issues as circumstances evolve. Trump needs to find ways to manage these tensions without making them worse, but his instinct for attack and intimidation may not be well suited to the delicate coalition management that the current moment requires. The union vote was a warning shot, a demonstration that defection is possible, and how both sides respond to that warning will shape the political dynamics of the coming year. The narrative of Trump being humiliated and Congress laughing off his threats overstates what actually happened, but it captures something real about the limits of presidential power when local political interests point in a different direction. Trump is not all-powerful. His threats do not always work. And members who need to protect their political survival in competitive districts are willing to cross him when necessary. This is not a revolution. It is the normal friction of democratic politics. But it is friction that Trump has not always had to deal with and that he may not be well equipped to manage. The union vote exposed the limits of his control, and those limits will continue to matter as the party navigates the challenges ahead.